Like,
Okay.
I wanted to ask, so what is the what is the colonial relationship that Congo has? Is it a French? Is it Belgian? Is it British? What is the story
So Congo, from the history that we have,
there? Hmm.
the area that is Congo now was inhabited about 90,000 years ago. And there was a kingdom around like the 1200s, a kingdom called the Congo with a K, uh, sort of blossomed in that area. So this is like we're talking about northern Angola, all the way to like all the way to the west, a bit west of Congo, to the west, all the way into the Atlantic Ocean. So this kingdom was pretty large. And the Portuguese, there was a Portuguese like sailor, who was one of the first people to come there.
Yeah, I'm
This
looking
is
at it. I'm looking at it on a map right now. I'm on Google
yes,
Maps,
yes,
and it's almost funny how big Congo is.
yes.
It's almost cartoonishly big.
It is massive.
it's it's almost,
If you were to take Congo for there's pictures on that you can find on the internet that show just
right,
the size of Congo could take up the entire west coast of the U.S. And in most of
right.
my speeches, I actually talk about this. So you're talking about like Wyoming, North Dakota, all the Dakotas, New
Yeah.
Mexico, parts of California. Like geographically, this is just as one country on the continent, and it's huge. It's massive. And so the historical difference between Congo Kinshasa and Congo Brazzaville is Congo Kinshasa, where I'm from, was colonized by Belgium.
Okay.
And it was colonized first by, it wasn't even a colony like many African countries were. It wasn't colonized the same way many other African countries were. It was actually owned by
Yes.
by King Leopold. So he considered it his property.
Yes.
Whereas other colonies on the continent of Africa were not properties, but they were colonies of countries. Congo was
Yeah.
just a
There was a
property
bit of a
of
sovereignty associated. Yeah.
yes. So and the way it was divided, right? So the in 1885, all the European countries met in Paris and they made this accord. They drew the maps that we now know, the borders of the colonial maps of Africa, and
Hmm.
Congo was drawn to the way it's drawn now. The one part that is Congo Brazzaville that was given to France because France wanted to own that part of Africa. So
Okay.
the difference between the two Congos is one was owned by a king, by a Belgian king. The other part was just owned by, it was a French colony basically. But culturally, I was going to say culturally again, like many other African countries, it's extremely diverse place.
Right.
However, when you go Congo Kinshasa and Congo Brazzaville, they're two of the closest capitals in the world, just literally divided by the Congo River. You can go by boat by literally 15 minutes by boat and you're into the other capital. Culturally, Brazzaville and Kinshasa are very similar people. They're part of the Bakongos. There's a whole different groups of people that lived in that area that have all mixed together. But in terms of culture, they speak very similar languages. So Lingala is the language spoken. You have French being sort of the colonial language or the language of national language spoken by the two countries. So that's how close they are culturally.
Okay.
Mm.
Interesting. So yeah, I'm looking at it now. So when I say, if someone says I'm going to the Republic of Congo, they're going to Congo Brazzaville.
Brazzaville,
If
yes.
someone says I'm going to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I'm going
Yeah.
to Congo Kinshasa.
Usually most people say DR Congo. Yeah, DRC.
Oh, okay.
Mm,
Oh, okay.
mm,
Okay. And so I have, and maybe you would, maybe you know, maybe you wouldn't, but
mm.
in the last, because I've only never really been to Belgium, but I suspect they're a pretty forward-thinking and progressive people. And so I'm wondering, in the
Yes.
last 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, has there been any formal government recognition by the Parliament of Belgium, by the Belgian royal family, the Belgian prime minister, etc., recognizing this event? So, in the same breath that the Parliament of Canada recognizes the residential school system,
Mm.
genocide of Aboriginal people, has the Parliament of Belgium officially recognized this, or is there still a, well, we'll see, da, 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 like, what's it like?
It's a very complicated, really, like Congo's relationship with Belgium is very complicated, in the sense that it's you really have to analyze the very different ways which Congo is still tied to its European colonial power, very similar to West African countries, French West Africa, and how they're connected very economically, to a
Right.
many degree, politically and culturally to France. Congo has a very similar relationship with Belgium,
Mm.
but the difference is that very recently, and especially because of the Black Lives Matter movement in Europe, we saw people toppling down like statues.
Yeah,
In
yeah, yeah.
Belgium, Congolese and most Black people were toppling down the statues of King Leopold,
Okay,
because
okay.
he was lionized, again, very similar to what you saw in the States. He was lionized by people in Belgium. So
Right.
there's this very interesting relationship between what the values of Belgium are and their recognition of the violence that was inflicted on Congolese people.
Right.
Now, parliamentary politically, they have acknowledged, of course, the damage done to Congo through by their king, um, because it was a genocide in Congo. It was one of the first genocides in the world that's unrecognized. More than 7 million Congolese people were killed during King Leopold's reign, all because of the extraction of rubber.
He was the
And
guy
then
who, if you didn't cut enough, if you
yes,
didn't harvest enough rubber, he cut your.
basically the during King Leopold's reign, this was also the when he was in power, when he was colonizing Congo, so 1850s all the way. This is when like rubber was becoming a huge thing, right? Bicycles
Yes.
were popularized in Europe around this time, right? Like we're having like cars being created, so rubber is an important mineral at this time. In Congo, what King Leopold was doing was he would use missionaries to write favorable articles about his civilizing mission of the
Mm,
Congolese
mhm,
people.
mhm,
And so the stories of what people would hear in Belgium was of their great king civilizing the natives by giving them schools, giving them shoes, etc. But what he was actually doing was he was putting quotas for rubber. And if you were a man, you were supposed to deliver a certain quota of rubber per week. If you didn't meet that quota of rubber, they first took your wife and your kids as prisoners,
mhm,
until you reach that quota. If you went
mhm,
2 more weeks without reaching that quota, the punishment was they would one ask you, or they would ask your children who wants to lose a body part.
mm,
And so they would cut your child or your wife, they would cut a body
mm,
part. Was it long or short? Do you want your long arm or arm? Yeah. So
mhm.
that was the consequence of not meeting the rubber quota in Congo. And this, it left a really really terrible scar on the it inflicted a huge emotional scar on the psyche of Congolese people. And
Right.
I dare to say that I think a lot of the examples left by the Belgian colonial rule ended up being almost like a motivation for a lot of the leaders that subsequently took over power from Congo, because they were the ones that are being rewarded. Whether it was Mobutu, who ruled with an iron fist, he learned
Mm.
that from Belgians, the colonial master, and he was
Well,
rewarded politically in the international community for that. So.
mhm, mhm. Okay. So when you started speaking, the first thing I wanted to do is I want to get a Belgian history textbook
Mm,
that they would teach in public. I am very curious
mm,
what the average fourth grader in history class in Antwerp is learning. You know what I mean?
mm, mm,
Like, do they water it down? Because I'm sure you know. I'm thinking of with American public schools. Depending
mm,
on the state, they'll say, "Oh, slavery wasn't so bad. They got to have free housing. They got to
mm.
have the leftovers."
Yeah,
And then
they were.
obviously, you know what I'm saying? They got a little chow mein, little something, and then in a progressive state, they would tell the full story, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm
Mm.
wondering, is there a so I don't I have no idea who makes the textbooks in Belgium, but I'm gonna Google it and see,
Yeah.
or maybe the Belgian embassy can mail me one or something like that. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I'm definitely I'm very 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 curious
I
to
would
know.
be too. I would be too, but I think it becomes, I think, with any when you involve the monarchy in general, right? There's this like visceral cultural connection that the monarchy has with certain people.
Yes.
Even in Uganda, for example, the Baganda kingdom has this like visceral cultural connection to people, that people see themselves as Baganda first before they
Mm,
see themselves as Ugandans, right? And there's very difference there. And so, I'm sure in Belgium it probably works the same way, that there's still, especially the conservative base mostly, that still sees like what their monarchy did, their president did, as less as like as violent or as vile as most people would progressive people would think.
mhm.
uh but I know that their current king, I believe, I think he's a much more progressive person. And I think but one of the biggest challenges I think that they still have, Congo and Belgium, is that Belgium looted a lot of African
Right.
artifacts and history and kings, like, so there's a lot of things that were taken from Congo that I still have not been returned. And this
Yes.
is one of the huge conversations that I think, one out of the Black Lives Matter movement, the toppling of their king's statue
Mhm,
in Brussels.
mhm,
um, this is the sort of the conversations that are now starting to be had. Is one, how do you return things that were stolen years ago?
mhm.
Of course, they were also implicated in the killing of Patrice Lumumba, who was our first prime minister, along with the CIA. And it wasn't until very recently when they actually told the truth about that. So, and accepted their part in his murder. So,
Right. I mean, yeah, that I could almost write that book. Like that's the oldest story in African politics.
hmm
Is the our first president got assassinated by the CIA. That's almost a book club at this point. You know what I mean? We should
yeah.
have varsity jackets and stuff like that. It'll be us, Guatemala, Ghana.
hmm
You know what I mean? We'll all-
Name a place in the world, and the U.S. or
Exactly.
some country in Europe has a hand in assassinating their leader.
Right. There you go. But I do have before we. I want to jump topics a little bit, but I want to ask you one more question.
Right.
Do you believe in the concept of genetic trauma? And maybe you're familiar with
Mm,
this, maybe you're not, but I just want to, in less than a minute, describe it. What I mean is, I've heard that, quite simply, that the grandkids of Holocaust victims feel the pain of their grandparents,
mm,
quite literally. And the argument and the logic is that if a level of trauma that is
mm,
so significant happens to an entire ethnic group, hence
right.
genetic,
Right.
that trauma can be so significant and so impactful that
Mm,
in the same way that generations later we can see the impact of a meteor, we can see
right.
the impact of an earthquake, we can see
Right.
the impact of whatever, that same sort of measurability
Mm,
exists with
mm,
trauma. And
mm,
so I'm wondering, you're talking being Congolese, and then you're just talking about the weekly quota and
mhm,
getting the families to decide,
mm,
that kind of thing. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there's some PhD thesis out there saying that the great great grandkids of the people who had to make that decision are
mm,
fucked. You know what I mean? So I'm just
mm.
wondering, have you ever heard of that, and what do you think about
Yes, I remember reading about it somewhere. I can't remember where, but it was someone who was, I think that it was through the conversation of reparations. It was on the conversation of reparations, and the woman, I think she's a doc, she has a doctorate. I think she's a professor too. She's a black woman, who was talking about the idea of generational trauma, and how
it?
much the slave trade of, or as well as slavery in the United States of human beings, um, left a significant impact on the genetics of
Right,
young people, former slaves.
right, right.
I wouldn't disagree. I think I would have to read more about it to really
Yeah.
understand how that works. But I
Mhm.
wouldn't I wouldn't just dismiss it out of hand, because I think, what is genetics, because it's also about like cultural, it's a very cultural thing. You think about if you faced such level violence continuously, because in Congo again we're talking about from the 1850 59 all the
Mhm.
way till 1909, where Congolese people, so this is like decades, hundreds years,
Yeah.
it's 100 years of people
Yes.
being maimed and killed. Like when you really start to put into context, right,
Mhm.
the average person, so basically imagine your whole life you're being subjected to seeing people or somewhere someone within your family does the cutting of people's hands
Yes. Exactly.
for a mineral. Like imagine
Exactly.
what that does to the psyche of a person,
Right.
and how they're able to see other people and what lessons they teach to their kids, how they, you know, then you really start to imagine that it's not more of like, when you talk about biological, people tend to think like, oh, he left some kind of like DNA imprint. But what is DNA? What are
Mhm.
learned experiences, I guess, you know? And how do we define those things? How do we live as human beings? We are the product of generations and generations of
Right.
people who did face a lot of trauma. And is it so weird to think that some of those traumas have impacted us in certain ways and our behaviors and how we think?
Yes.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. No, I think. But yeah, certainly I have no. I don't. I couldn't explain the science to you.
Yeah,
Chromosomes and stuff like that. I have no fucking clue.
yeah,
But I. Yeah. It's just exactly. I wouldn't. I would be a fool to dismiss it. You
right.
know what I mean? I really think that there's a lot more to it.
And you're from Ghana too, so how? Because and I know especially in Ghana where we have like this was the route for slaves being taken
Yeah.
into the Atlantic. So how did like, do you ever think about that?
Oh
And have
yeah,
you ever gone
absolutely.
back to Ghana and actually maybe seen that in people?
So yes, I've gone back to Ghana, but I haven't been back in 20 years. So
Mm,
it's sort of a moot point in that sense.
right,
But ask me in 2 summers from now when I go back or whatever.
right.
But I would say, and I think this is something that is worldwide, but
Mm,
in Ghana, there's definitely a real example of it. And
mm,
it is the default assumption that the white thing or the European thing or the British thing is
mm,
inherently preferred or better. So
mhm,
like just the notion of like how you set up your school curriculum, the British system. You know what I mean? Like everything, like our parliamentary system with the fucking, we still like the Supreme Court of Ghana. They literally
mm,
still wear powdered wigs. I'm not making that up. In 2021, the
yes.
Supreme Court of the Federal Court of Ghana, you're seeing these guys, and they're as black as me and you, and then they got curly white powdered wigs on their head, and it's just this default. And then, but then, of course, if it was a traditional Ghanaian
Mhm,
attire on their head, that would be that's tribal.
mhm,
You know what I mean? Then it's
right.
tribal. Then it's a different conversation. But when it's British, then it's official.
Mhm,
So there are these little. It's almost, and it's not almost. It is semantics,
right,
but within the semantics, that's the whole ballgame.
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just the difference between using the word tribal and official or
Mhm,
historical or whatever. So
right.
definitely uh, that exists, but I would, and then again, as someone who hasn't spent very much time in Ghana at all, I would say that we are now starting to see sort of post year of the return, etc.,
Mm,
a real modern Ghanaian culture and Ghanaian heritage. That is
yes.
that we're not about the Gold Coast. We're not talking
Mhm,
about Kwame Nkrumah anymore.
right.
We're not telling the same old, because right. I mean, the story is one day we got independence from a European country, and then we had coups and generals and civil wars.
Mm,
And if we don't have and if George Clooney or Bono doesn't give us a shout out, then we're just sort of in the wind. You know what I mean?
mm,
And like that's been the narrative for that's what you grew up on. That's what I grew up on. That's just been, it's when I think of Craig Kielburger and I think about that, that's just the narrative. You know what I mean? Like,
mm,
thank goodness the white people have come to shine light on our plight, and like Rick Mercer and the malaria nets, and it's just like, and the life straws, and it's just it's this there was this narrative of like, here, little buddy, here's a calculator, let me show you how to do things. And it's like, and I really think now that we're turning the corner on that. How do you feel as a Congolese man?
It was very interesting going back to Congo after 22 years.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the defining characteristics of a diaspora is the idea of an imagined home. All
Hmm.
diasporas, as it's called in Greek, um, you know, are we all have this like sense of home that like it's this beautiful place, and even when if you have kids, especially, you describe to them what it was like when you were a kid, and then when you return, you sometimes get really surprised by the change that has happened, but also the change that has not happened. The change, for example, going to Kinshasa and watching a robot. Uh, there's a robot literally in Kinshasa that directs traffic. Of course,
Oh
not
wow.
sometimes not everyone listens to the robots, so
Okay.
everybody just drives the way they see it, but it's there.
That's
And
crazy.
then and then
That's
you
so
go
crazy.
right? You can I mean, when I say that, people are like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, in Kinshasa there is a robot that directs traffic." And
Just
he was
like so,
actually
like red light, green light, left turn, right
yes,
turn, all that.
yes. It's in the middle of like a roundabout type of
Yeah, yeah.
street. But and
Hmm.
so it does red light, and it puts up an arm, directs basically go left, go right.
Wow.
It lights basically has like eyes that have the lights on, so it red when he wants one to go. And anyways, it's very interesting. I have a video of it. I posted it on my Instagram.
Okay, okay,
And
okay.
but then you realize also that it's the unchanged things that haven't changed, things like the pothole that you left when that you saw when you were like 3 years old, and that pothole is still there. It's just much bigger now, and that's the change that has happened. All in all, to say that I think the continent is many things. It's like a paradox in many ways. It's this
Yeah,
paradox of a place where things are ever changing and things are not changing in many places.
right.
But I think, to me, I think again, I've been writing on this actually for a few days. It's it really is indicative of just the leadership in general that we praise in the world, that we reward in the world, and how that leadership manifests itself in our communities.
Mhm.
Congo, as an example, like I said, we had Mobutu was in power from 1965 all the way until 1998 when he was finally out of power.
Right.
That's decades and decades of having one leader, and he was opportunistic, he was egotistical, he was loud, he was abrasive, right? He was strong. Again, these are when people talk about leaders, these are some of the qualities that people tend to talk about when we talk about leaders.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
But he was characterized also by the lack of empathy, the lack of he didn't change, because of his ego. He never surrounded with people who were able to sort of guide him into
Hmm.
new ideas or embracing changes that happen. And so he became one dimensional. Yet he ruled over a period of time when Congo was actually one of the most successful countries on the continent of Africa, right?
Right.
We had our music was to this day was legendary and impacted so much of African music from the 60s all the way into the early 1990s. Congolese music was so legendary and made huge impact on that. Yet, so people have this imagined idea of what a leader should be like in Congo, and they want to have the same leader as Mobutu. They always say when you talk to Congolese people, man, I wish Mobutu was here now.
Hmm.
Man, I wish Mobutu was our president. I wish we could find a president who was like Mobutu. That would be great for the country.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
yet we don't realize that, yes, we have those leaders who are trying to emulate what Mobutu did, but he had a lot of cronyism. It only hired people that were exactly like him. And so we kept reproducing the same leaders over and over again. And it's the same leaders that we're still having in power. And those leaders are rewarded, like I said, internationally through the way they're praised, their connections and the partnerships they have with different either communities or international organizations. And so what you get is this Congo that's moving forward with young people, very young country, but yet its leadership is so backward and
Hmm.
unmovable, unchangeable, because
Right.
of of the way it's of the structure and the power that it derives from the international community. And so Congo's moving forward. And I think it's an example that you can say across Africa, I believe. It's just that, depending on who the leader you have in power,
Hmm.
most of the time determines how progressive and how forward your country moves. I'd say Ghana, for example, even though he's problematic, but your president is the current president is quite progressive in his thinking, and I think that reflects in the certain decisions that he makes and
Yeah.
how forward moving Ghana is, for example. So,
Right. Yeah. No. Definitely. Akufo-Addo is he's not perfect, but I
mhm,
think contextually,
yes,
uh, certainly in a historical lens, I'll take it where I can get it. And I so I got no problems with him because you're right. It's you it, when you look at the rest of the gambit and you look at the the history of leadership,
mm,
you know, leadership through violence,
yeah,
leadership through coercion,
right,
leadership through intimidation,
mm,
and then this never-ending tribalism bullshit
yeah,
that exists, which is invented,
yeah,
you know what I mean? As I don't think there's any other as a Congolese person, maybe only a Rwandan can tell you better how made up and arbitrary ethnic lines can be. You know what I mean?
mhm,
And
mm,
it's very, very frustrating
yeah,
because it's one thing to talk about ethnic lines when you're playing a soccer game, when you're
right,
playing sports, when you're talking about architectural styles, fashion styles, cooking styles, linguistic poetry. Yes, we should very much discuss the rich tapestry and diversity that exists on a ethnic level. But when it comes to a general desire for toilets that work and roads that don't have potholes and schools that have books, like that's not an ethnic thing. That's not an A or B or what team, you know what I mean? So that as a Ghanaian, I would say probably the most frustrating thing is we are still addicted to tribalism, and like we will give we will make people doctors and pilots who aren't qualified simply because of their last name and
yeah,
simply because of who they're married to. And it's
yeah,
just like Jesus Christ, like if you're going to give someone a job based on cronyism, make them ambassador to the Bahamas, give
mhm,
them a cushy job, at something to do with the opening ceremony of the
mm,
Olympics, or some
mm,
soft job. Why would you give them a job that requires technical skills,
yeah,
bilingualism?
mm,
You know what I'm saying? And so
yeah.
it's very frustrating.
I think one of the problems with tribalism on the continent, I think it's such a multi-layered, like such a multi-layered thing, um,
Hmm.
because historically human beings we come from tribes, and so
Yeah.
we have this very like biological thing that my tribe is going to take care of me, even though it's not true. Sometimes your tribe is going to stone you to death. uh
Exactly. Exactly.
but there's biological need to belong to a certain tribe. You can see it even here even in Western countries when, again, while they might not mention tribe, it's mentioned in like, are you conservative or
Right.
progressive or liberal, whatever.
Right.
And this is sort of the cultural conversations we're having. But I think all of those are also driven, the other layer to it is that it's also driven by the inequality that people face. Like the more you feel like there's less of the pie that you're taking, you feel like you have to hoard it, and you have to hoard it and then share it with people that you connect with on a certain level. And so I think on the continent, you're having this thing where there's been so much inequality that has been built up for years and years,
Hmm.
for a number of reasons, because of corruption, because also of structural adjustment policies by the IMF and the World Bank, that has exacerbated poverty on the continent. Is it has bred and has continued to cultivate this feeling that everyone has to stay in their tribe to get a piece of the pie.
Yeah.
But it's such a in doing so, most of the leadership that has tended to lead most of our African countries has not even dared to broach that conversation, because again, it goes to their power. But I
Mhm.
think it's so important that on the continent that conversation is had for so
Yeah.
long, because it's so easy, it's such an easy thing to accuse African countries of tribalism, even though on a natural level African countries have been and have always been very diverse in culturally,
Yes.
uh, and continue to do so. And it only happens, if you ever notice, it only happens when there is an attempt to shift power. That's when tribalism gets activated. But when
Right.
it's everyday living, people don't really care or think about like who you are. At least in Congo, and I would have to, I'd have to attribute this to a very specific policy that Mobutu um, impact that put forward in 1975, when
Mhm.
he changed Congo into Zaire, and he instilled this pride of being a Congolese person. He instilled this idea everyone had to have a Congolese names, right? He was culturally, he was cultivating this pride in being a Congolese person and your culture. But he was against tribalism, and if there was ever an organization that was trying to advance these ideas of tribalism, they were shut down like, quickly. He was
Absolutely.
not about tribalism, and I would attribute a lot of the, I would say a lot of African countries have faced the issue of tribalism. In Congo, it was never so until very recently. Never in Congo would you ever hear a person of another tribe killing another person from another tribe because of these tribal divisions, until very recently, because of so much poverty that has accumulated within Congo, that again people are feeling that they're getting less of the pie, and so they're all going into their tribe because they feel like if I'm in a collective, then perhaps I can have a piece of the pie. Maybe my group can also have something to say in the national dialogue and in the national conversation and in the sharing of power.
Yes.
So yeah, that's I think that in my thoughts when I think about really all those issues when it comes to Congo specifically and on tribalism, those are, I think, are my exact thoughts for now.
Okay. Okay. Solid. Solid. Okay. So to sort of pivot a little bit, but stay on the topic of tribalism. Of course, we have to talk about the royal family, and I don't think there's any greater, more stark example of tribalism than what we saw in the last little bit.
Mm,
So I guess it's not because I don't want to. Well, like I guess I only have 2 points or questions that I want to pose to
mm,
you, and it sort of dawned on me that I am not a subscriber to any of the British tabloids. You are
mm,
not a subscriber to any of the British tabloids, but the only reason why I know these papers exist is because larger media organizations
mm.
echo their message.
Yes.
So it's like, oh my God, like they were so mean to Megan. And then they show how they were mean to her. But if
Mm,
they just shut up about it, then like it dampen, it's not as big. And
mm,
so it's sort of so it's like BBC, they don't write mean things about men, but they'll report on the people who do. And the New York Times doesn't say mean things about it, but they report on the people who do. And so it's like I'm kind of like I really don't want to. I'm not here to talk about the royal family. Like I don't give a shit about that. But or I mean maybe you can if you want to. But like it's I guess I'm just frustrated because another day has gone by and it has dawned on me that I'm witnessing another, this is a performance. This is another invented scandal by a few dozen people in media circles to decide what the conversation is and decide what the narrative is. Like it only dawned on me the last 24 hours. Like no one in England, there's no actual dinner table conversation where they're talking about Meghan Markle picking cotton. No one in England actually thinks that. But because some jackass decided to write a headline about how she's straight out of Compton or how she's went from picking cotton to the royal palace, like that that is a decision made by one or two or three human beings. And then now when CNN picks it up, it's the British people are talking about it, or it's the talk of the town, or it's all everyone can, and it's very like I'm seeing how the game is played.
mm,
You know what I mean? I'm seeing like, oh, like we're not gonna talk about colonialism. We're not going to talk about mental health. We're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
So I'm just a little bit frustrated. So I'm wondering, like, am I being too cynical, or do you sort of see it that way as well?
I mean, first, I would just want to say, I don't want to minimize um, the experience that Meghan Markle went through. I think when somebody says that, like, they reached a point of suicide, I think that's as somebody who's faced a lot of, like, really emotional experiences in my life.
Mhm.
I can understand that on a very visceral level, and so I don't want to dismiss her experiences.
Yes.
um and as you said, whether the discussion, the conversation of the royal family and who they are, like, that's on them. That's a
Right. Right.
conversation for another time.
Yes.
Them
Exactly.
as a people. uh However, the coverage of it, I think, is so it's just so terrible. But I
Right.
think that, there was this, I was reading this very today, actually, because I'm writing a speech, and one of the articles that I was reading was talking about why people like reading sad or really terrible news.
Hmm.
And apparently there's a whole psychological reasoning to this, is because, most of the time people tend to believe that the world is such a good place, that their
Hmm.
world is so nice, that we actually have a very positive outlook on life. So when we hear something really terrible, it shakes this belief that we have in our mind about our world. And so we read, this is why we click on the articles that are really sad, this is why we watch the news. And
Yeah.
so, and because that's the news that we consume, the news themselves are businesses, and
Yeah.
they want clicks, they want views, because they want to make money. And what
Yes.
what are the articles that people read, click on? What are the views that are, what are the shows that people tend to view quite a lot more on TV? They're the ones that shake the foundation of what they believe the world they're in, right?
Yeah.
People also want to compare themselves, to other people. They want to see other people suffer. It's such a really terrible thing, but psychologically, you can see the reasons to why we these things are in the media and why the media focuses on it, right? Media is no longer about news. Media is about making money. And like we talked about last week, the head of the Washington Post said it. He said we would have never reached our subscriber goal had we not covered Donald Trump so negatively the way we did. Sadly, not many people are critical enough to understand those rules, because in our also economic system, most people don't have that time. Most people are working two, three, four jobs, and by the time they get home, they either want to just watch really shitty TV, and if they're really into news, they'll watch the news. But the news that they want to watch is to again, like I said, psychologically, they want to know that, hey, my world's not that bad. So they'll
Yeah.
watch why the other person's life is really bad. So they're going to follow through with that news. And I think, it's extremely irresponsible the way journalism has become,
Yeah.
where it's again, they're in the business of making money rather than the business of just writing news. And so, and that's the really sad part of it all. It's just watching the way, you know Joe Biden literally gave a decision for the US to go and bomb Syria, which is illegal under international law, and 22 people were killed.
Yeah.
22 people were killed. However, nowhere have I seen any coverage of that. And even
Right.
if it was covered, it was probably in the editorial section, hidden somewhere where no one
Right.
could even, it's not given the airtime, because again, it shakes the foundation of what people want to believe. They want to believe that Joe Biden is a good man, and that their world is about their country, the United States, Canada, that their countries are better than the other countries.
Right.
This huge furor on Meghan Markle, I think, is again just an example of people who, our obsession with celebrity culture again comes from that psychological need, like I said,
Right.
to want to know that somebody else is suffering more than we are. Which again is, it's a sad state of affairs, that's how we think. But I think we've been enabled by a media who has picked up on that very issue and has just put it on overdrive. um
Yes.
and that's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah. It is. It's unfortunate. Like, I honestly, I have to sort of give my hats off to the people who run society,
Mm.
because they've set it up in such a way that as soon as you realize the you sound crazy. You know what I mean? So like, it's such a stroke of genius, because right now, like, you and I are like criticizing the media on like a pretty high level, but
Mm.
like, if we were to bring other people into this conversation, they're like, oh, look at these like, the media controls everything.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
think Jeff Bezos is sending a message, and
Mhm.
blah blah, and it's just like, it's the framing is so fragile, like
Mhm.
it's almost made out of glass, made out of crystal,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like, if you challenge it at all, like, you sound like a lunatic.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, just
Yeah.
imagine 10 years ago challenging capitalism. Cuckoo, cuckoo, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, "Look at this guy
Mhm.
over here. We're gonna
Mhm.
all eat grass and
Mm.
live in the woods." And
Mhm.
this, it's just like, you know what I mean? Like, it was so like, and then like, think 20 years ago to challenge gay marriage. So then I'm gonna marry my dog. So then you're saying I'm gonna marry a tree. And then what's gonna happen? And it's such a the status quo is such a comfortable position to be in,
Yeah.
because like, even mild criticism of it, you sound like a lunatic.
Mhm.
You sound like, you want to give healthcare to everyone. You know what I mean? Like, you have to, you have to artfully and masterfully and over the course of generations kind of make that argument. You know what I mean? Like,
My
but to
God.
just
Yeah.
wake up and say, "Hey guys, let's give people healthcare." Like, this guy's fucking nuts.
Yeah. Imagine, right? Imagine, but like, oh, we have to go and bomb Syria.
And
Oh,
it's like, yeah,
sure. Yeah,
yeah,
that sounds about right. Our country has a right to defend itself. But
yeah,
it's like, that's illegal. And talking about the trauma that we were just talking about, imagine the trauma that the young people of Syria, and this is again the cost of war that people never talk about, and I talk about it in a lot in my speeches, is it's very easy to go to war because we've lionized war through our movies, through culture. We've normalized war and violence, and we tend to not really talk about the cost of war. We only talk about the cost of war, of what it costs for us to put boots on the ground.
yeah,
We
right.
never talk about the cost of war once those boots are off the ground, and the psychological effect that causes, the damage that causes to those communities, socially, morally, and that damage is much greater than the damage, than the economical damage done by putting going to war. But yet, it's so sad that how that conversation is being like, what, this person is
Yeah,
crazy, like,
right.
so what, you want other Hitler to come around? I'm like,
Right.
really?
It's like, and yeah, it's just, it's very funny how it, like, that argument style is set up. But